Hello, I'm Pete Costello and this is going to be I hope, an easy lesson on basic blues slide guitar. Basic doesn't necessarily mean bad or simple sounding. You can do an awful lot with just a few basic moves on slide guitar as long as you get your technique down to scratch. On this I'm concentrating on slide technique, so I'm basically only concentrating on what this hand is doing. The picking hand, all I'm going to be doing is just basic strumming. If you want to learn a lot of finger picking, etc., fancy picking, flat picking, whatever, other places to do that. I'm just concentrating on basic slide guitar technique. Tuning. Slide guitar is often played in what's called open tuning, so instead of your guitar tuned in the standard tuning of EAD GBE, it's instead tuned to an open chord. In this case it's tuned to open D, which is D, A, D, F sharp, A, D. The reason for that is that in standard tuning you're relying on forming complex finger patterns to make a nice sounding chord, like that would be the shape for a sort of full on E chord. In slide guitar basically you've tuned it to an open chord, so it sounds a full chord sound with the open strings, and it also means that you can move that up and down the fretboard just with a simple bar, just straight across all the strings. So of course that means when we've got a slide, you can slide that chord up and down the fretboard. Dog's had enough, as you can see. In terms of slides, I just use a fairly simple brass slide. It's quite a thick one, this one. You can get slides of various thicknesses made out of various materials. Glass is very common. In fact, this form of playing is often called bottleneck blues because the original slides would have been made out of the necks of bottles, literally. You can get them made out of steel, chromed brass, ceramic, all sorts. I like a brass sound because I like the sound it makes, and the brass sound has the advantage of, when you drop it, which you will always do in pubs, on pub floors, etc., it doesn't break, whereas bottlenecks do. Okay, for playing slide I use the slide on my little finger. You can play it on whichever finger you like, really. The most common ones are the little finger or the ring finger. I've basically just got used to playing it on the little finger. That's how I prefer it. Also, when I've got the slide on, it's not sort of flapping around. I will use the ring finger just to sort of hold it in place, and that gives a lot more control over the slide. When you're using the slide, first of all, you're generally using it perpendicular to the fretboard, i.e. in line with the frets. That way you're sounding a nicely intoned or nicely in tune chord. If you had sort of really slanted slide, it starts going off, so you want to hold the slide perpendicular to the fretboard or in line with the frets, and that gives a nice in tune chord. When you're resting the slide on the strings, you are pretty much resting it on the strings. You're not pressing down very hard at all. All you want to do is press down enough such that all the strings sound quite cleanly. If you're not pressing down enough, or if you're not pressing down on all of the strings, you'll tend to get this sort of unattractive buzzing sound. Although sometimes you might want to do that if you're doing some sort of rough and dirty blues. It can be a sound you use, but I'd advise you to learn how not to do that to start off with. And the other thing you're doing is you're not pressing down so hard that the strings are touching the fret. If you were doing that, you're not actually sliding, you'd be doing the same as just barring. We want the slide to actually act as the fret in a way. It's acting as a fret that you can move up and down the fretboard continuously. So we can get whichever note we like, basically, out of the strings. So, straight slide, pressing down just enough such that all the strings ring cleanly. And the other thing that is important to do is to try and damp the strings behind the slide. If you don't damp the strings, when you're using techniques where you've got open strings and then you're moving the slide and pressing it down, you get this unattractive buzzing once the slide hits the strings. If you can damp it just with the sort of fingers behind the slide, you can then put the slide on and take the slide off much more gently or cleanly. That'll be the post. Apologies for the dog. The other reason why we damp is if we don't damp, we can often get a lot of sort of overtones ringing behind the slide. Again, sometimes we might like those. There's quite a nice sort of 12th fret ringing effect you can get where you're hitting the harmonic, but generally we want to try and damp down those sort of overtones. So yeah, so straight slide, just the right amount of tension on the strings to make them ring cleanly, and try and damp behind the slide, so you're killing off any of these overtones. Okay, let's look at 12-bar blues. A basic 12-bar blues in D, so an open D tuning. You've got 4 bars of D, which is just open. Then 2 bars of G, which is your 5th fret. 2 bars of D again. A 7th fret, a bar of G, 5th fret, a bar of D, open, then it's just nice to finish on that A. So that's your basic 12-bar blues. Now, it's nice to sort of mess around a little bit within that 12-bar blues. That was using the open strings, 5th fret, 7th fret. What's perhaps a good example to do is to just look at sliding into 3rd fret, 5th fret, 7th fret, 10th fret, and 12th fret. And back down again. That's probably a good example. Sort of practice exercise, although what I think it's important to try and do early on is to not really think of things in terms of exercises. It's more to actually get a decent 12-bar blues going and to practice that, because it just sounds so much better.